A pojagi is a wrapping cloth that is used to wrap items for storing or for giving gifts or for protecting and carrying things. Today I'm going to show you how to make this beautiful 4-patch pojagi. To make this 4-patch pojagi, you're going to need some fabric and thread, and you can get a kit that has this cotton silk blend fabric and silk thread in my shop, so there's a link below if you're interested in that. But you can also try this with other fabric and thread combinations. So besides the fabric and thread, you're going to need some pins and a needle, and look for a needle that's pretty fine. It should match the weight of your thread with a small eye and a sharp point. You're going to need small scissors for clipping the thread, large scissors for cutting the fabric, and you will need a hair marker, and this is used to mark the creases in the seams. You'll also need a large quilting ruler, so either a square ruler or rectangular ruler is fine. You just need to be able to measure 10 inches. So once you have all your supplies, then we're ready to begin. The first thing we need to do is to cut out the 4 squares that make the 4-patch on the pojagi. So in your kit, you're going to see there's a large piece of fabric and a small piece of fabric. So the large piece of fabric is also used for the lining. So that's why there's more of it. So out of both pieces of fabric, you're going to cut 2 10-inch squares. And just be sure when you cut them out of the large fabric that when you cut them, you'll cut them out of this part, so that leaves a large square that is left. Don't cut it this way or you won't have a large square. You'll have to piece both sides of your pojagi. Cutting out the pieces for pojagi is different than for regular quilting. We're going to begin by marking the seam lines, and to do that we use a hair marker. So when you're using a hair marker, be sure to have something underneath your fabric. This will help protect your tabletop, and it will help the creases show up in your fabric. So just something like an old notebook, or this is even just an old cereal box, something that's a little bit soft but still firm. So I'm going to begin by marking the seam, and you want to mark it with the grain, but be sure to leave at least 1/4 inch past the edge of the seam. So I'm going to hold my ruler in place and then firmly move the hair marker back and forth along the edge of the ruler. So there you can clearly see that there's been a crease made in the fabric, and it will easily fold along that line. So now, using my ruler, I'm going to continue to mark out a 10-inch square, being sure that there's at least 1/4 inch of fabric beyond that 10-inch line that I am marking. You can clearly see the marked line. Now cut out the square, leaving 1/4 inch seam allowance beyond the marked line, which will be the stitching line. Once the pieces are all ready, begin by joining them in pairs of 2 different colors. To join the pieces, lay them wrong sides together, and then we're going to fold in the seam allowances and pin them together, being sure to align this side seam allowance and pin together along one edge of the seam. Now this fabric has a shiny side and a more matte dull side, and I'm stitching it with the shiny side out, but that's just a personal choice. And then be sure at the other end that the marked seam line matches. Your seam allowances might not be perfectly the same size, and that's fine as long as this seam line matches. So once it's pinned together, we're going to begin stitching the seam. So thread your needle and then tie a knot in the end of the thread. And you might be wondering about the color of the thread that came in your kit. Traditionally in pojagi, a different color of thread is used. And the stitches will be visible, and it is actually part of the design. So don't panic about it. Just enjoy that as part of the design. So we're going to bring the thread to the front, right at that seam line. And then we're going to take an overcast stitch. And work along the seam with the overcast stitch. Try and keep them about the same size, and don't take too big of a bite out of the fabric. You don't want an overcast stitch down here, because remember, these are going to have to open to lay flat. So we want them to be snug enough to keep the two pieces of fabric together, but not so tight that it's going to cause it to bunch up. So continue working the whole seam with this overcast stitch. So once you've stitched all the way across the seam, we're going to knot the thread, but just before we knot the thread, take a minute and open the fabric, finger pressing the seams open just to make sure everything lays nice and flat and smooth. If you need to adjust the tension in the stitches so that it lays flatter or so that they lay beside each other, then now's the time to do that before you knot the thread. And so once everything is ready, just take the needle back to the wrong side of the fabric. And then make a knot in the seam allowance. So once both pairs have been joined, you're going to join these two together to make a 4 patch using the same seam technique. So once you have the 4 patch pieced together, then lay out the big piece of fabric right side up, and this is going to be the lining. So don't worry about cutting it to size, just put the whole piece out, and then we're going to lay the 4 patch piece on it right side down. So these are right sides together, and just smooth everything out, make sure everything's nice and smooth. And the seams in the 4 patch, just finger press those open so that everything's nice and flat. Then we're going to pin all the way around the edges. And use lots of pins to make sure that the two sides will stay together and nothing will shift. So once the two pieces are pinned together, then you're just going to sew along the crease line, the seam line that's been marked, all the way around the 4 sides, leaving a little piece about 3 or 4 inches a little gap so that we can turn it right side out. So this can be stitched either by hand with a running stitch or on a sewing machine, and just use any thread that you would normally use for piecing. So either cotton or polyester is fine, just a straight stitch around the edge. So once this has been stitched all the way around the edge, then just with scissors, trim off the backing fabric so that the seam allowance is the same size as the top part. Once it's all been trimmed, then just turn it inside out through the hole that we left. And then be sure to gently poke out all the corners. And then just give it a good press, and in the hole where we turned it, press those seam allowances to the inside. Now that it's all pressed, we're just going to hand stitch this opening closed using a slip stitch or ladder stitch. To slip stitch the opening closed, thread a needle, put a knot in it, and then bring it up right in the seam from the inside. So right now we're in this fabric. We're just going to take a little straight stitch right in the seam pressed on the other side. Then we'll take a straight stitch on this side. And you can see that the stitches will pull the two sides together, but they will be invisible. So that's why this is sometimes called a ladder stitch, because your stitches will be going straight across between the two sides. When you get all the way to the end of the opening, take a couple tiny stitches to secure it. And put a knot in the thread and pull the knot to the inside in between the front and the back piece. Then we'll clip the thread. And there it is, it's all closed with invisible stitches. The pojagi is now finished, and you can see the nice 4-patch design. To wrap an item, lay it piece side down in a diagonal shape, and then center your item in the middle. And then I'm going to begin wrapping with the color that matches the lining. So gather up these two corners, and then we're going to tie right over left and then left over right. And then repeat with these two corners. And then you can always just adjust the little ties. But there you go. There's your item beautifully wrapped. If you want to learn more about the history and use of pojagi and see other great tutorials, check out ebitastudio.com.